Hey everybody, my name's Derek, CEO and founder of Wenwyn, helping you when you need a win at the intersection of leadership and culture. This is part two of a three-part interdependent series. So these aren't independent episodes, these are interdependent episodes on cities, churches, and leaders, particularly why they matter when it comes to advancing culture, advancing civilization, making a better tomorrow, building a better tomorrow. In this episode, we're going to talk about the role of churches as it relates to culture. Before I get going, let me encourage you. Hit the like button or hit the subscribe button. We'd love to have you a part of our channel, be a part of the community, help with the great algorithm in the sky. But we hope that you find this content both interesting, engaging, thought-provoking. Well, there's a lot more than both, right? There's both implies too, but that this episode and this channel really does help you in many ways and helps you practically have insight into the culture around you. All right, let's talk about churches. Now, last week we talked about cities and transcendence. Why is it that someone can be in a family, feel like a black sheep in their city and in their family, and yet move to somewhere else and go, "Oh, I belong here. Well, this feels like home." Yeah, I'm not, I was born in New York, but man, I moved to California and I found a beach town, and this is my jam. This is my vibe. This is what I'm here for. And so we talked about transcendence and we talked about belonging, that there's a sense of belonging in place and belonging to each other, belonging to the city, right? New York to California or Santa Barbara, wherever that is. But there's also a sense of the transcendent space, the cities sense of belonging in the cosmos, in the world, and its relationship with the transcendent. And that has very practical implications. It impacts how we view morality, it impacts what we do, it impacts our longings, it just impacts so much as a collective, as a city that is seeking to belong to each other and finding their place in the world. Now, if you're going to deal with transcendence, it helps then to talk about churches because you're in the area of spirituality. Last episode, I talked about shamans and kings and all of those things. It's helpful to talk about churches and their role within the city and within the culture in society. Now, this kind of begs a question, which is why not just talk about it in terms of profits and nonprofits, right? Nonprofit organizations or profit organizations. And the answer is because we're talking about how to navigate the intersection of leadership and culture. Culture requires knowing or understanding longing, which will ultimately inform differential and therefore strategic and competitive advantage, as well as gaps in the marketplace. So it's ultimately going to impact nonprofits and for-profits and all of those groups. But churches specifically, not just any nonprofit group, but churches specifically deal with the transcendent, and they deal with the heart, and they deal with the places that people not just work, but where they live and where their heart is and who they align to and how that relates to their movement in cities. Now, that kind of begs a different question, which is why then are most churches left out of civic conversations? It didn't used to always be that way. It used to be you engage churches in civic conversations. Now, I know we have kind of short-term memory when it comes to that, but really for most of history, you wanted to engage the spiritual leaders in the direction. And if you just even think about the Bronze Age, you wanted to engage the prophet, if you were a king, with the war that you wanted to engage in or win to determine whether it was sanctioned or not, or determine what that prophet thought about the war. It was helpful to get their input. Um, well, here's why today most cities, they acknowledge churches, they recognize that they're there, but they actually tend to leave them out of civic conversations. Here's the reason. Most churches tend to preserve rather than progress the city. So as a result of trying to preserve rather than progress the city, they resist change instead of innovating change. Um, on the one hand, that makes sense. If you think of transcendence, transcendence is unchanging. And so the idea is, well, let's preserve a sense of an unchanging deity or deities or however, whatever religion we're talking about. I happen to be a follower of Jesus, so I subscribe to Christianity. So we'll just use Christianity as an example. This idea that just says, look, God is unchanging, and therefore we should do our best to create a space where people have a sense of an unchanging, transcendent God. So, on the one hand, it makes sense why most church leaders seek to preserve rather than progress the city alone. But on the other hand, and particularly for Christianity, it doesn't make sense. You know, churches are to love neighbors and love enemies and be a blessing to cities. That's actually something God talks about over and over and over again, the Christian God of the Bible, the God of Yahweh. We see Joseph, an Israelite who is deliberately placed as second in charge to Pharaoh in Egypt, specifically to preserve Egyptians, to help Egyptians, to be a blessing to Egypt. In the process, God uses Joseph to help save his people from the terrible drought and famine that had occurred. So Joseph, as a spiritual head, as a spiritual leader there, and representative really of God's people, isn't there to hate Egypt. He's there to bless Egypt. And this is early in the Old Testament. If you think about Daniel, who goes through many regime changes, pretty violent regime changes, actually. Daniel is a statesman, he's a politician who represents God constantly and represents insight and wisdom, and he's for the best of that civilization. Now, he doesn't participate in all of the values of that civilization because he sees them as, well, frankly, not being helpful. And he makes that decision early on. Like, you want to create men who are strong. This diet isn't helping. Let me suggest this diet. It honors my God, but I also think because of that, it's not just that it honors my God, but I think it's actually the better diet. Turns out that worked. And so we see that in the life of Daniel because he is in relationship with the transcendent. He is seeking the betterment of everyone because he wants them to really understand that that's insightful. There's an insightfulness to following Yahweh. In the book of Jeremiah, God's people are taken into exile. That means they're scattered. It's the great diaspora. And now we have cultures within cultures. Well, there's plenty of that around the world. There's plenty of cultures within cultures. Anytime you go to a dispersed people group in any given city, you can find cultures in cultures. But God gives very specific instructions. He says, I want you to be a blessing to the city. He doesn't say, circle the wagons, do everything you can to not be a part of the city. In fact, I want you to fight against being a part of the city. He does something extraordinary. He says, no, I want you to retain your allegiance to me. I want you to hold my values. I'm not saying you have to behave like the city. I am saying you should be an advocate for the city. You should bless the city. You should be helpful to the city. In the New Testament, we're told to be great citizens of our city, to render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, but also that we are to behave well with respect to outsiders, that we are to be great citizens within the larger cultural context. Now, there are moments where the culture is at such odds in its value propositions that Christians simply can't participate. That doesn't mean we have to be jerks. It just means we can't participate. So the classic example is Caesar is Lord. Early Christians said, I'm sorry, I can't say Caesar is Lord. I can only say Jesus is Lord. And because that was a threat to a polytheistic state, which essentially said, look, Yahweh can be your God. You can say Jesus is God. That's fine. We get it. Jesus is God. But just say that Caesar is also Lord. But they said, no, we just can't do that. There's only one Lord. And if he's Lord, we bow to him alone. That didn't make them bad citizens. In fact, when they began to persecute the early Christians, we actually have letters from major politicians in several cities that are going, these are some of our best citizens. They're our best workers. They're our best thinkers. Where the people are drunk, they're sober. Where other people are kind of given to wild impulse, they're considerate, like they're kind, they're helpful, they take care of the sick. Like, there's all kinds of contributions that Christians made to the city. And so the reputation of the early churches under persecution was like, why are we going after these citizens? Kind of all the way up, even to the 20th century, when you see Christianity's impact on society, and you see how Christianity actually helps advance society. Suddenly you have greater access to medical care. Suddenly there's greater wealth in the society because there's greater trust because of the morals on which Christianity is based. The Great Welsh Revival, suddenly there's no more cursing. The police don't know what to do. They're doing barbershop quartets. I could kind of go on and on and on here. There's plenty of evidence. That actually gave rise to a whole branch of theology called liberation theology, which essentially said, we so love the effect of spirituality and trust in Jesus on society, let's just keep that. And that's the justification for it. And so we want a better society. So we're all going to do this for a better society. So it's not about Jesus, it's about the better society. But clearly, Jesus seems to work. The challenge with that is there's really no explanation for the change internally or externally, unless there really is a sense of allegiance shift and belonging to a transcendent God. And so liberation theology, though it had great intentions and certainly acknowledges the impact of Christianity in society, falls short because it assumes that it's an outside-in process and not an inside-out process. All right, that said, my point here is that church should be a vanguard in culture. Innovation in music. J.S. Bach wrote some of the most incredible music of all time. He did it unto the Lord, very devout believer. Michelangelo, a great artist, right? So my point here is the church can sponsor and do things for society that are a benefit and enrichment to society. I am in no way saying that all talented people are in churches. That's not what I'm saying. I'm in no way saying that all nice people are all in churches. That's not true. There's mean people in churches too. But what I am saying is that the church has a significant contribution in society itself, on business leadership, on nonprofit leadership, on hospitals, on charities, on helping others, on Habitat for Humanity, on all kinds of efforts that actually make society a great place to be. And one reason to have a non-taxable entity in the church is because of the church's contribution to society. In fact, they've actually run some studies on this. That contribution, just through the nonprofit church sector, is in the trillions of dollars. There's so much that happens when the church decides it's going to progress culture, because now it gets to talk about how. And you can talk about the transcendent and belonging, and really you can choose to be helpful and be a blessing to the society that you're in, even if that society holds radically different values and morals than you do. It's not saying you have to agree with culture, but it is saying you should at least love them enough to want to work for their benefit. So the hardest workers, the non-complainers, should really be the Christians. The most trustworthy should be those who say, my trust is based in a transcendent other, not based in what I can get away with. So we actually need churches in a city to create more churches. That's helpful because of them working together and what you can do in a city to bless the city. But we also need our churches because of the sense of morality and transcendence in a society, as well as a basis for that morality and transcendence. Now, having said that, I know that there's a complicated history there. I know that there's many cities that feel disappointed by some of their spiritual leaders. And yes, the church is also full of broken people. And there really isn't a good excuse for those who have a transcendent basis to not choose to live by, in the case of Christianity, by the moniker that Jesus actually is Lord. That's in name, that's not in allegiance. And I know that history and culture is complicated with that. Some people think they're born within certain religions, and therefore that's what they are. But ultimately, just like the way cities boil down to belonging and transcendent belonging, so too do churches, how they belong together and how that church represents a transcendent belonging in the broader aspect of culture and society.